The first point was brought forward when violent riots burst out 3 years ago in the poor suburbs of Paris, populated mostly by families coming from Maghreb and from Black Africa. And at this time, the spokespersons of French media intelligentsia explained that the desires of those young rioters was just to eliminate all what stood before themselves and the objects of their desire. And of course, the objects of their desire were quite simply the images of consumer society, the images of the goods that they saw on TV. So the inhabitants of the poorest suburbs turned out to embody the narcissism and hedonism of consumer society. And in parallel, the anti-capitalist students' movements of the 60s, and more specifically the French movement of May 68, were accused, in retrospect, to have paved the way for the triumph of the market. Through their criticism of authority and institutions, so the argument goes, they allowed our societies to become free aggregations of unbound molecules, whirling in the void, deprived of any affiliation, entirely available to the empire of the market. The demonstration entails the recourse to a last element of the Marxist tradition, the theory of ideology, showing how the individuals taken in the grip of the social machine only see its inverted image and consequently do the contrary of what they think they are doing. This is how a very influential book written by two French sociologists explained that the anti-authoritarian movement of 68 had given to capitalism in a time of crisis fresh thinking and new weapons, allowing for its rejuvenation. The book was called The New Spirit of Capitalism, and the argument was that the movement, the French movement of 68, developed what the authors call an artist's criticism of capitalism, claiming for artistic values such like authenticity, autonomy, and creativity at the expense of the claims of true social criticism, struggling against misery, inequality, and bourgeois egoism. Now, their claims for autonomy and creativity, they said, paved the way for new forms of management based on individual initiative, collective creativity, and overall flexibility. This alleged takeover came as supplementary evidence that those who rebel against the system are unwilling accomplices of this system, cheated by the mechanism of ideological inversion. Now, in the Marxist tradition, the opposite of ideology is science, which enlightens the way of the social machine and the future toward which it is heading. Now, what if the future itself is a triumph of the global market? So it turns out that the so-called end of the grand narratives is much more a remix of its elements and a reversal of its functioning that ends up proposing two alternative versions of the same narrative, either the optimistic and progressive narrative mixing Marxist historical necessity with the economical state in the providence that makes evil serve the triumph of the good, or the pessimistic and reactionary narrative of democratic humankind destroying itself in its frantic thirst for consumption. Both versions come to the same conclusion, which reads as an inversion of the slogan of the new American president, change, no, we can't, which means, of course, no, you can't. You can't for two reasons. First, because you cannot and must not oppose the historical necessity that will draw the good from the evil. Second, because your will to change will add up to the disastrous reign of democratic individualism leading humankind toward its self-destruction. So I try to map briefly the mechanism of this reversal of the critical un-Marxist tradition that incorporates it into the logic of domination. Now, from my point of view, this incorporation itself has been made possible because that tradition had borrowed some patterns of description and argumentation from the logic of domination against which it was struggling. And this reversal may thus appear as the last form of the historical tension between two ideas of emancipation. Well, It turns out that the clarification of that tension has been at the heart of my own intellectual journey, and notably of the book whose translation is the first reason for my visit, The Knights of Labor. The starting point for this journey was my dissatisfaction with the concept of ideology and the conception of ideological domination, which I had previously illustrated myself by contributing to reading Capital with Louis Althusser. According to this conception of ideological domination, people are exploited and dominated by a system, the logic of which they cannot understand, because the mechanism hides itself in the production of an inverted image. In short, people are subjected because they think that they are free. The only thing that could really free them in this logic is a knowledge of the reasons of their subjection. Unfortunately, the access to this knowledge is said to be impossible for them because subjection brings out the impossibility to see the reason for it. In such a way, the logic of the ideological mechanism in that logic turned out to be a perfect circle. People are where they are because they don't know why they are where they are. And they don't know why they are where they are because they are where they are. In short, they can't because they can't. So the optical mechanism appeared to be grounded on an a priori distribution of positions, an a priori equation between a position and incapacity. What I tried to do then is to strip the equation of its scientific disguise. People are not unable because they ignore the reason for their being there. They are unable because in this logic, being unable means exactly the same thing as being there. So behind the Marxist explanation of the optical mechanism of ideology, we have to hear the voice of a much older prescription that dates back to the origins of Western philosophy. As Plato put it in his Republic, there are two reasons why workers must stay at their place. The first reason is that they have no time to go elsewhere, because work doesn't wait, which appears to be a merely empirical fact. The second reason is that they have the aptitudes, the intellectual equipment that makes them fit for this occupation and for nothing else. So there is a perfect equation between an occupation, the occupation of the artisan, and a mental equipment. Being a worker is an occupation that entails that you have no time to be elsewhere than the place you are geared up for occupying, which means that you have no time to chat on the agora, make decisions in the assembly, or look at shadows in the theater. This is what I called later a distribution or a division of the sensible, a set of relations between occupations and equipments, between being in a specific space and time, performing specific activities, and being endowed with capacity or incapacities, of course, of seeing, saying, and doing that fit those activities. It means a distribution of positions which is embedded in a framing of the visible, the sayable, the thinkable, and consequently the possible.